Hatapu, Uncle Tristaneb. This is your brother Kapra Patah coming at you with another video. This one is called Kemet and the Seeds of Gnosis. Before we continue, I'd like to pay homage to my ancestors, teachers, and guides, those who are here and those on the other side. I say Hatapu and Uncle Tristaneb to all those who would like to view this particular video on the Seeds of Gnosis, and I hope each and every one of you are expanding on your journey. This is going to be a part one of a series. And we're looking at having at least maybe a 3-part series to this particular one, okay, on Gnosis. And that's because many are being brought to the study of the Gnostic teachings these days. So I think that's important because many are making the attempt to link it back to Kemet. And they have good reason to, because of the location where many of the teachings came out of, as well as the discovery of the Nag Hammadi text back in 1945. So some would say that these are the secret teachings within Christianity, and others believe that they're simply the remnants of knowledge that have been suppressed and is now being revealed, and it's enwrapped itself into many today's religions, yet working as the mystical path of achieving enlightenment. So from my point of view, the seeds of Gnosis do have their origin in Kemet, interpreted in many different ways by many and suppressed by those who wanted to stay in control. Gnosis is a state of knowing that is beyond the senses. To be a Gnostic is not necessarily particular to any one religion. One of the main teachings of Gnosticism was and is that matter itself is a prison. The philosopher Plato, an initiate of the Commission teachings, understood that each individual has the natural blessings of access to their own divine spark of reason. Unfortunately, we have been in a prison to our own 5 senses and our desires. The ancient Gnostics understood this world to be an imperfect copy of a more luminous one. The world was created by what is called the Demiurge. The Demiurge is the lesser god who is believed itself to be the supreme being, and humanity is under control and tyranny of a group of entities called archons. The archons manipulate humanity from behind the scenes to get us to do their bidding. They manipulate us through our fears, our beliefs, and our desires, and they cause conflict and distract us from why we're here in our mission in this realm. Because we are incarnated in matter, we have desires that keep us in a state of dissatisfaction and suffering. And the fact is that the soul itself, incarnated, has forgotten its origin and is now in what is considered to be a prison for the soul. So one challenge that comes with the human condition is us losing recall of our origin and being misaligned with our life purpose. The Commissions say, Ba to heaven and body to earth, and all things arise from the none, a state of non-differentiation. Light arises from the none and expresses itself in a multitude of forms. So we're at the same time now in which ancient knowledge has been rediscovered. One example, as mentioned before, is the Nag Hammadi texts discovered in 1945, and they're so named because they were discovered in Upper Egypt, aka Kemet, by a man named Muhammad al-Samam. And a content was written by Christian Gnostics who were speaking the Coptic language. But regardless, more and more discoveries have been made within the past decade, proving that the ancient ones were more intelligent than given credit. But when it comes to Gnostic teachings, we will see that it did not just encompass one particular school of thought, but many different points of view. And this is also a hint at the possibility that there was an understanding of the uniqueness of the spiritual journey of each individual. Unfortunately, not everybody was always supportive of this fact. Like, for instance, around the 2nd century AD, you have Irenaeus, who wrote a huge body of work to refute what is considered to be heresies. His focus was to refute Gnosticism, with his own target being the school of Valentinus, which was being propagated at the time by Ptolemy. The Valentinians seen themselves as Christian, but they were very mystical, and they were also assertive in reaching out to people and bringing others into their school of thought. Their influence made an impact on the Roman Empire and would be active up into the 4th century AD. Like most forms of Gnosticism, the Valentinians believed the individual had the ability to gain direct experience with the divine. This was the time when heretics were not treated nicely and were often put to death, and this was clear in the actions of the one named Theodosius. Look him up at some point in time. We see that from the Gnostic concept of Christ, the focus was not necessarily directed towards the historical person, but more or less a state of awareness and an aspect of consciousness. Yet they were aware that the universe was intelligent and that the other universe, that is the outer universe, was a reflection of our inner universe. And therefore, not just only can you communicate with your inner self, but you can also communicate with the universe that appears to be outside of you as well. Okay, so as above, so below, as within, so without. The Gnostics often called these principles aeons, which were not just considered to be aspects of time, but also they were faculties that make up the supreme being, in which we call the pleroma, which is the fullness of existence. So in the archons, the control our world, they push fear, and they put the fear in us to try to disconnect us from the very thing that could set us free, which is our access to spirit. Therefore, we must explore what is called pistis and gnosis. Pistis is a Greek concept that began as a goddess of trust and honesty. But under the Christian belief system, pistis is the concept of grace as a gift from God, as opposed to gnosis, the attainment of divine knowledge. We look at the Christian Bible, and it talks about Adam knowing his wife. This is because to know is to be intimate. To know the truth is to be intimate with the truth. And at the same time, it brings forth the understanding of the true mystery of knowing oneself. To know oneself is to have an intimate relationship with oneself. In part Hem Haru, that is, the book of coming forth by day, in the Perdem Heruim Ger, the scribe Anui says, Rek Rena, meaning I know my name. And the name is one's identity, and also the sound and vibration that carries and calls and summons it. So it's a form of knowing yourself. This is why it is good to have a good name. And let your name bring forth a sweet savor with your good works. The scribe Anui also says Nukba and Tur, meaning my soul is divine. But he also says not a member of me is without divinity, meaning that unlike later teachings, the Cometians understood that having physical forms allows us to express ourselves and define our existence as individuals with their own unique experiences. Hence, the Cometians had an understanding of the four elements known as fire, air, earth, and water, as well as their qualities. These elements are also the process of cycles that are forever fluctuating, expanding, and contracting, which is a way for us to understand, once we master these elements, that we can rise above the limitations and base faculties to the higher sense faculties, which takes us beyond the limitations of our senses. The method is not to see the body as a curse, but transmute our body temple into a vehicle for divine expression, and that is how we elevate beyond the limitation of our senses. In fact, the Cometians honored the body temple so much that upon death, even after life, it was considered useful, hence mummification. To truly love oneself is to truly know oneself. To truly be a person that's in touch is to fall in love with both genders within yourself, the masculine and feminine principle uniting from within. This is awakening of the fullness of self. So when we look at ourselves as being incomplete because we've been taught that we're incomplete. But the way you find love in your life is to find that completion within, a marriage of the yin and yang principle within each and every being. This is love, and this is beyond lust, and it's unconditional, which would be called agape. Now, when we take it back to ancient Kemet, we have the word mr, meaning to plow, is also the name of the plow, as well as love. So when we tap into the Cometian idea, we remember that love is identified with being able to plow and cultivate the land. In this land, we have found balance. When we beautify and cultivate the land, we create a balanced environment along with the food so that we can feed our families and our communities, our children. We can eat. And when we are loving towards plants in which we grow, they flourish. And when we're loving towards our children, they flourish. The same thing can be said when it comes to love for higher knowledge. It flourishes and the universe gives access to even more until you find yourself gaining knowledge from beyond the senses. Now, Gnosticism wasn't really on the radar of Christianity, of course, before the birth of Christianity. Not to say that they didn't have forms of it that preceded the church, okay? But the source material that came down to us as Gnostic texts rely on Judeo-Christian flavored information, but with a more mystical twist, where Christ may be recognized as a spirit being in which we can all access. It was not so much based on dogmatic beliefs, but achieving states of awareness that liberates us from the limits of physicality. Yet it has to be understood that our physical bodies are necessary for us to have certain experiences. The problem comes from not gaining control of our survival mechanisms in which our subconscious dominate. This is why so many of us succumb to our passions in an unhealthy way. We have to understand that there was an unfortunate chain of events after the decline of Kemet, around after the 7th century BC. This opened up the eventual invasion of Persia, the Persian army invading Kemet, and led by Cambyses at the time. And next we had the Macedonian and Greek occupation of Kemet. It was the one known as Alexander III, in whom people also know as Alexander the Great, that arrived in Kemet around 332 BC after taking Syria from the Persians a year before. After the death of Cambyses, Darius III took control of the Persian Empire. Alexander moved in on the Persians, who at the time were under the rule of Darius III, and defeated them. Let me be clear. Alexander invaded Kemet. That was also under Persian occupation. He defeated the Persians in Kemet as well, and with little to no resistance from the Cometians, having yet to recover from Persian occupation, he made Egypt a part of his empire. Alexander himself did not wait too long before he went out to consult the oracle. So in 331 BC, Alexander visited the oracle of Siwa in the Siwa oasis. As legend would have it, he was guided by 2 birds to the temple of Amun. Here it was revealed that he was indeed the son of Amun. In his game before, he had also consulted the oracle of Delphi, to my understanding. We learned that he was a son of Zeus, and you will understand that Zeus and Amun were considered the same entity, okay? The same being. So after this, he was declared a god on earth and began to be depicted as a servant of Amun on walls and temples in Kemet. Let's be clear and keep in mind that due to Alexander's tutoring under the one who is identified as Aristotle, he could have been revealed secrets of protocol that would have allowed the priest to open up to him, okay? History also shows us that Alexander was indeed made a king, aka a pharaoh, in which he had been given his 5 names, which all kings of Kemet had bestowed upon them. So the name that Alexander had, his main name of royalty, was Setepenre-Meri-Amun, and this name was so important it had the rope around it so that it could be protected, and this was called the Shenu. So Alexander passed away in Babylon in 323 BC at the age 32 to 33. Now the interesting thing about it is that Alexander was struck with some type of an unknown fatal illness where it took him 12 days to die, and after 6 days after his death, his physicians noticed that his body showed no signs of decay. More recently, it is being understood that Alexander may have suffered from an autoimmune disease known as GBS, which stands for Guillain-Barré syndrome, and it starts out as abdominal pain and spreads throughout the body, paralyzing their body until the individual is unable to move, but the mind is still functioning. This means that while appearing dead, he was unable to tell anyone. So in other words, while he was alive, he was being entombed, or for lack of a better term, buried alive. Now his body was mummified and placed in a golden coffin, which is a 70-day process. Or when you say buried alive as we know it, in other words, he was being entombed, whether or not they operated on him to remove his organs or not. He went through the process, possibly while he was still alive. Okay? So, anyway, this is more based on recent information. Where recently in the year 2019, where they had discovered or claiming to discover the tomb of Alexander. Now, the one named Ptolemy, who would take charge of a fragment of Alexander's empire in Egypt, he would be known as Ptolemy I Soter, the founder of the Ptolemaic dynasty 305 BC, and it was he that began the construction of the Library of Alexandria, and it was he that eventually wanted total dominance, but he wasn't able to do so if he could not establish some kind of relationship with the priesthood of Kemet. He deemed it necessary to unite Kemet and Greek culture and religion under the neter Serapis. Serapis was a combination of the neter Osir and Hapi, or the Greek Osiris and Apis. Of course, Osir is the neter that represents the divine ancestors of the Kemetians. He also represents germination, regeneration, as well as the cosmic cycle of renewal. However, the Apis bull represented the same spirit of Osir in animal form, and the bull was a symbol of strength and power. The sacred bull Hapi also functioned as a living oracle. Yes, the bull himself was part of a system of divination. So, one form of divination is when he was taken through a labyrinth, that is the bull, and whichever room he went into was read as an omen deciphered by the priest. And we'll see that there's a similar system that still exists in Africa among the Dogon of Mali, where there be patterns drawn in the earth, and the footprint of the fox would be read when the diviner sees that the animal has crossed over the patterns. And this is how the oracle was utilized to predict the outcome of an event, as well as how to cultivate their crops and feed their people, or how to bring balance to a force that needed to be addressed. That is a force in nature. So the worship of Apis, or that is the homage of Apis, was prominent in Mennefer, also known as Memphis, where the sacred bull was also identified with Ptah, and Ptah is the divine craftsman of the universe. Now, the depiction of Serapis that was referred to or preferred by Ptolemy was Hellenized, that is, a Hellenized bearded man with a container of grain or corn bushel on his head, and this corn or grain are identified with Osir. However, this version of Serapis resembled the Greek deity Zeus, and many would say that this is where you get the beginning stages of the image, what would later be called Jesus. And some would argue that this image is a created creature in which Arius may have known about. So, when we look a little bit deeper, we'll see that Arius, as well as the church fathers, may have known a little bit more than being portrayed in our history books, and for those who would like to talk about the history of the church. Okay? They were striving to bring the image to life while simultaneously covering up his origin. Ptolemy reestablished the worship of Serapis in Alexandria at the temple called the Serapeum. Now later, the Roman Emperor Hadrian established that the followers of Serapis called themselves bishops of Christ. Now Christian apologists are saying that this letter was written by Hadrian was a forgery. So this is something that we're going to explore, family. You know, one of the things that I am is honest as I can be about my research and what comes to me and what is revealed to me. So we must understand that the knowledge gathered out of Kemet and other parts of the world was concentrated in Alexandria, aka Alexandria, Egypt, and brought together intellectuals that were Roman, Greek, Jewish, and of course native Kemetian. But the elite of Alexandria spoke and wrote in Greek, and so did the Jews who were gathered there, in which 72 Jewish Greek-speaking rabbis would write what is called the Septuagint. Not to mention that Alexandria also was a center of commerce, so there was much going on. And this would spawn many thinkers who developed their own schools of thought. The problem with this form of government that wants power and control is that if there are too many intellectuals and thinkers, and not to mention those reaching higher levels of consciousness, it becomes harder and harder to control that type of population. This would lead to the need to start the greatest dumbing down campaign in the history of man and woman. The greatest dumbing down campaign in history was the method of choice where religion was utilized. And we will see in part 2 of Kemet and the Seeds of Gnosticism that it was the Romans who created an empire that pulled it all together, that is, brought Kemet down for the count, and mostly how it led to a chain of events that still continue to shape our world to this very day. With that being said, family, we will have part 2 coming soon. May you have a wonderful and productive day. Hatapu, Uncle Jasanab.